next speaker is Ryan Adams, a professor at Princeton. He was previously at Harvard University. His interests are in the computation that lies beneath intelligence and the development of artificial systems that can discover complex structure in data. Ryan, please.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to do a couple different things. I'm going to talk about some old work, and I'm also going to talk about some work in the spirit of kind of a NeurIPS workshop that's so new that there's not really results, but are some things that I'm pretty excited about. And it's going to be focused on rodents. So let me start out by telling you about a problem that some folks in Carlos Brody's lab at Princeton have been thinking about. So this is a biological reinforcement learning problem in which you have we have a rat who is trying to solve a two alternative forced choice task. Okay, so this little trial begins. It's presented with an auditory stimulus, and then there's a delay, and then it's presented with another auditory stimulus that's either higher in pitch or lower in pitch than the first one. And the idea then is that based on whether or not, so the pitch is higher or lower than the first one, it should make a decision about whether or not to go right or left. And if it gets it correct, then it gets a reward. In this case, like a little bit of water. And so you can see the kind of the reward diagram here, or rather the kind of the correct actions as a function of these two tones. Okay, so the idea is that over time you give the rat this task a lot, and hopefully it's learning to accumulate expected reward. Here's a little video of one of these rats doing this, and one of the things that's amazing about the Brody lab is that they can have lots and lots of these things going all the time and kind of do sort of high throughput behavioral experiments. So you can see he's in the middle there, and then there's a tone that you can't hear, but that he makes a decision about whether or not to go left or right. Okay, so maybe not too surprisingly, because this is a really simple task. The rat's able to solve this problem over time. So you can think of this. The rat is either getting a 0 or 1, depending on what it does, and or that is on whether or not it gets the reward or not. And so it kind of would start out kind of nearly at random, and then over time get better as it sees a lot of data. And this is already kind of interesting, kind of without anything else, because we can think of this rat's learning process scientifically as its own dynamical system. Okay, that is to say that the rat has some kind of interesting dynamics going on, and that as it's trying to accumulate rewards. And this is a little different from inverse reinforcement learning, because we imagine that the rat has some algorithm, right? And we just don't know what that algorithm is, and it has interesting components, and maybe it maps on to sort of algorithms that we understand in computer science. But it's different than inverse RL in that it's not the case where there's a reward that we don't know. We know what the reward is. We're giving the rat the reward. It's just a question of like, how is the rat solving that problem? And so then, for example, there's some great work here at NeurIPS by Jonathan Pillow and collaborators on sort of trying to ask these questions. But there's kind of even more sort of interesting things to think about. Like, for example, if we see a rat kind of trying to solve this problem over time, how is it balancing exploration and exploitation? Presumably, it's making some kind of interesting decisions that are noisy or perhaps strategic about how to gather information. And you'd like to be able to perform some kind of coherent model, sort of model comparison from the data. Actually ask empirical questions about how at least one model, sort of biological system, might learn this. Moreover, the rat gets bored quite often, and that is to say that an interesting fraction of the times the rat doesn't actually do the task, and so and that kind of matters for the experimentalist and the science. And maybe we'd like to understand also kind of when the rat chooses to do things. And more generally, of course, the science here is we'd like to ultimately be able to understand how this connects to things like the actual neurophysiology of decision-making and learning. And one might hope that if you kind of perform this interesting kind of system identification, that eventually you'd be able to find interesting neural correlates and so on. Here's the thing. So I showed you this figure, and you probably noticed that I didn't put the x-axis on here. And so I'm now going to reveal the x-axis to you. And you should observe that those are very large numbers. That is to say that this plot is actually showing you one rat, 17,500 trials to get from sort of not very good to still not that great but better, right? So it's still sort of getting it wrong like 25% of the time. After 17,000 trials, let me put this a different way. So it's doing about 300 of these trials in a session. There's one session per day, And here I'm showing you the same data, but instead of just sort of arbitrarily smoothing it over like 200 trials, instead I'm now showing you the average per session, and the x-axis is sessions, so days. And these things are going, going 7 days a week. And so the point here is that this thing is learning super slowly. That this doesn't seem like a very hard task, right? Like, is this tone higher or lower? Go left or right. And yet it takes a very, very long time. Like, we're talking almost 4 months here for this rat to learn any kind of competence. And still, it's wrong quite often at this task. I find this to be kind of amazing, because, I mean, rats are pretty smart, right? Like, if we could build a rat, we would have solved most of AI, right? And so so I kind of feel like it's pretty interesting, and it opens up a kind of a new range of other kinds of questions about learning to control the rat's control system. So if we imagine that the rat is itself trying to solve this RL problem, we have this kind of meta experimentalist RL problem in which we'd like the rat to learn faster, perhaps. And so we could ask this question: can we sort of keep the sort of the setup the same for the rat, but try to make optimal decisions about what stimulus to present in order to sort of maximize the rat's reward, which is kind of a proxy for our own. And again, this is some stuff that people have started to be thinking about, and you could imagine if you could kind of imagine ways to solve this problem. Not only would we wind up with kind of maybe new and better science of like biological learning, but you could imagine figuring out how to personalize it for different rats. And of course, the point here is ultimately as well to get good at this problem generally, so that we can help people learn better and faster. And of course, so this connects to lots of great work by folks like Emma Brunskill, who have been thinking about reinforcement learning for human education. Of course, with rats, you can do all kinds of unethical stuff that you can't do with people. And so it's still kind of a very nice thing to study. So this is something this is the kind of stuff I'm excited about, but now I kind of want to shift gears and talk about how, of course, like simple tasks like this are in some ways not representative of the things we ultimately want to be able to understand. And so this is a mouse, not a rat, and it's doing some sort of arbitrary thing where it's not trying to learn anything except that it's just sort of wandering around. And this is from Bob Dada's lab at Harvard Medical School. And the kind of what we'd really like to figure out long term is how to sort of combine inference and control, right, in such a way that we can understand interventions and understand learning dynamics of naturally behaving mice exhibiting the actual kind of sort of complicated behaviors that actually map interestingly onto the kind of like neuroscientific and also human questions that we'd like to be able to answer. That is to say that if we teach this rat something, or ask it to solve some task, or give it some drug, or modify its genes, can we quantify how its behavior changes? And this is something that Alex Wilczko and Matt Johnson have done sort of quite a lot of work on over the last couple of years, and I'm going to sort of tell you a little bit about that work and how it motivates some work on that Matt Johnson has done with collaborators on thinking about the combination of graphical models and deep neural networks. So the sort of big picture being that we can gather data now in kind of interesting ways, using in this case like a depth camera, and we can do it at scale. Like folks I mentioned in Carlos Brody's lab, they're able to do this with kind of mini rats, more or less 24/7. And we'd like to be able to combine this amazing data with probabilistic machine learning methods that hopefully will give us interesting kind of new scientific insights about natural behavior and the way things learn and social dynamics and all the kinds of different things that we'd like to be able to do in behavioral neuroscience, and maybe ultimately inform sort of the human experience. So there's kind of two different views here. So looking forward, of course, we'd like to be able to do what I'm showing you here, kind of on the right, where we're trying to sort of figure out how to optimally teach rats to do things. But we've done a lot of work on the left of trying, in the absence of trying to do anything optimal, just trying to, in some really basic way, understand what the behavior is of mice in an unsupervised way. And this is in contrast to the sort of like the kind of baseline of having grad students label lots of frames of video. And the reason you might kind of want to do things with unsupervised learning is because, of course, grad students might reasonably disagree on what the mouse is doing at any given moment. So the inter-observer error rate on this kind of thing is very high. And of course, we want replicability when we do this, when we do any kind of neuroscience. Also, of course, the rat or the mouse is probably behaving on a time scale that isn't relevant to the human, right? And so the grad student's time scale may just have nothing to do with what the mouse thinks is going on. And then additionally, anytime you have this kind of labeling type task, it necessarily requires sort of an anthropocentric view on things, right? You have to assign human language to what the mouse is doing, and the mouse doesn't care whether or not you can describe what it's doing. And so you'd like to be able to do this in a way that is somehow kind of taking the human out of the loop, is reproducible, and and kind of not anthropocentric. So the way that we frame this problem is to sort of think of this as a kind of unsupervised discovery of like a behavioral language. So imagine that the data, instead of frames of video, were like the waveforms, and you wanted waveforms of speech, and you wanted to learn language, learn syntax, and structure of language from like raw speech waveforms. Here, raw video, and what we imagine is that the mouse and across populations of mice, there are sort of discrete types of behaviors and interesting dynamics over those behaviors. And what we'd hope to be able to do after discovering them is then ask questions about how, if the mouse is learning over time, or we modulate it by altering its genome, or by adding fox pheromone to its cage, like how does this, how are these kind of behavioral syllables and their dynamics, how are those things going to be modulated? One of the sort of the ways that we have liked to think about this is to model the mouse as a switching linear dynamical system. And so this takes seriously the idea that there is some latent discrete state that's shared across the population of mice, and that those latent discrete states are hopefully interpretable and have some interesting discrete dynamics. That is to say that we'd like to be able to summarize mice by something like a Markov transition matrix as a kind of higher order way to talk about what a mouse is doing over time. And the idea then is that these discrete states modulate lower level continuous states, and you can think of these continuous states as being kind of like kind of mouse physics, right? The continuous like joint poses and things like that actually turn into the frames of video that we see. And it's natural to think of this in a sort of as like a graphical model with some global variables and some local variables, and then the idea is that there's some likelihood that's trying to connect that latent structure to these pixels, right? And one would hope to be able to turn the crank on this and be able to do interesting inference. But of course, if you've messed with these kinds of models, you know that it's very hard to explain high-dimensional data with this kind of low-dimensional Gaussian type state space models. And moreover, you'd like to be able to do this with many, many, many frames of video in order to do it at scale, and that's not something necessarily that Bayesian inference is often good at. Ultimately, what we want to try to do is find some kind of balance between having very simple things. I showed you a very simple task where the mouse is just making, the rat is just making a very simple sort of decision between two things. And there's a variety of kind of things that neuroscientists do to set up simple ways to summarize mouse behavior. We'd like to be able to ask more complicated questions about mouse behavior and about mouse learning and ultimately about biological systems. But of course, and it's often tempting sort of in the sort of current moment of machine learning to just throw like a giant neural network at that. And if you do, it will sort of learn to predict like frames of video, but it doesn't necessarily give you sort of interpretable structure that you're then going to be able to understand scientifically, or perhaps straightforwardly manipulate in the service of accelerating learning. Sorry, and here I mean the learning of the mouse. And so what we'd like to do is find a balance between these extremes and allow and take advantage of the great bits of deep neural networks in order to have flexible likelihoods and perform efficient inference, while also allowing for interesting probabilistic graphical model structure that we can then kind of look at and reason about directly. So this little sort of image is kind of, you can think of this as a kind of cartoon set of toy data that exhibits the kind of structure that is kind of hard here. So there's obvious discrete structure. If we imagine like every one of these points is like a frame of a mouse video. And there's some obvious discrete structure, and there's some, but within that kind of discrete structure, there is some non-trivial, sort of non-linear, non-Gaussian structure. And you could imagine throwing your favorite Bayesian non-parametric Dirichlet mixture of Gaussians or something at this kind of problem. And you could do that, and you will wind up with a quite good density model for the data, but you'll destroy the interpretability, right? You'll wind up over-segmenting because those little half-moon things are not very Gaussian. And so you're sort of, the impoverished nature of your component densities results in a mismatch, and so you won't really be able to understand kind of what's going on, right? The other kind of end of the spectrum you could imagine, instead of saying, well, I'm going to take my favorite deep density model and I'm going to warp a Gaussian using some nonlinear function until I'm able to model this density, and that will also capture the density well, but it suffers from kind of the opposite problem, the under-segmentation problem, which is that ultimately we wind up with just kind of a big mush, right? That nevertheless captures the density, but that doesn't retain structure that we'd like to be able to understand. And so the big picture goal here is to wind up with some balance between these, where we preserve interpretable discrete structure, but we're able to build that into flexible local density estimates, for example, that can capture the difficult parts of, that are non-Gaussian in these components. Ultimately, things like deep neural networks can kind of help us out with probabilistic graphical models in a couple different ways. I mean, one of them is this forward way in which we use a probabilistic graphical model in order to have a richly parameterized likelihood function. But then also, it won't surprise you that we can use these to perform inference and to help us with, in particular, with variational inference. The likelihood aspect of things, much like, essentially what I'm talking about here are variational autoencoders, right? We can take the latent continuous state that I previously sort of described as the kind of the mouse physics, and we can instead map that through a nonlinear function represented by a richly parameterized neural network, and then ultimately that thing can generate a Gaussian distribution over the frames of the actual frames of video. And more abstractly, we can think of this kind of model as being a situation in which we have some latent probabilistic graphical model that we can sort of, could be a time series or not, or any number of other things, in which we have some kind of two different kinds of things going on. We have some kind of interesting, more traditional probabilistic graphical model type structure with exponential family pieces and conjugate priors and things. And then we could have some sort of massively parametric observation model that takes a neural network and warps that graphical model into something that can handle high dimensional likelihoods and that looks, for example, very non-Gaussian. And this is, as a kind of a general purpose recipe, is an appealing thing to do because it allows you to sort of import the entire library of successful probabilistic graphical models from sort of previous iterations of NeurIPS and attach successful deep learning likelihoods to them and wind up with new flexible models. And not shown here, but is a kind of like one obvious example is something like saying, well, I just said that our rat learning could be its own kind of dynamical system. We could imagine writing that down directly as a state space model, and that being another kind of thing that we could then hang a neural network off of and perform inference in. And so I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about inference at a high level. I know I'm the thing that's standing between you and the coffee break here, so I'll just sort of go a little bit quickly through this. We basically do sort of the stochastic optimization, setting things up. That is to say, we try to treat inference as a stochastic optimization problem via mean field variational inference. We can view this, of course, as a bunch of stuff that we don't know in this problem as being a set of local variables, like properties of each individual frame of the mouse video, as well as some global properties. And we can turn that into a factorized approximation to the posterior that we then fit by minimizing the KL distribution, which can also be framed as an optimization problem that is maximizing a lower bound on the marginal likelihood. What's really nice is that in the case where things are nice and sort of conjugate and exponential family, you can take advantage of this really great work by like Matt Hoffman and Dave Bly and colleagues to turn that variational inference problem into a stochastic optimization problem just defined on these global variables, rather than the somewhat more traditional way where you would treat it as coordinate ascent and global and local variables. And what turns out to also be very nice from this work is that they also show that you wind up with natural gradient type algorithms that can kind of know about the sort of Riemannian curvature of the problem and wind up with faster convergence. The problem here is that we want to do some of that, but we also want to be able to hang a big neural network off of it. And if you hang a big neural network off of it, then of course the posterior distributions are not going to be nice and simple and are not going to admit these kind of simple sort of natural gradient updates based on the expected sufficient statistics, you're going to wind up with something quite ugly that you're going to try to approximate. And so one kind of very nice view on this is the sort of amortized inference view, in which rather than trying to perform that local optimization every time, build some other function approximator that looks at, for example, a frame mouse video and produces its best guess as to what the optimal local factor is. And so this, like I said, is often called amortized inference, and it gives rise to this very nice sort of view on these kinds of problems proposed by Kingma and Welling, called the variational autoencoder. So which sort of is this really interesting twist on the traditional autoencoder, but now instead of the decoder that's going from latent variables to observations, we view that as a likelihood function that's virtually parameterized. And the encoder that's taking observations and mapping to the latent space, we view that instead as a generation of a posterior distribution. So we're basically sort of thinking, sort of taking this sort of very similar view here on on performing approximate inference in these nonlinear models. So the point is to try to find a balance between the kind of the like Bly and Hoffman et al. Sort of view on the world and the sort of Kingma and Welling view on the world, right? So stochastic variational inference is really great because it can take advantage of graphical structure. You get to perform sort of arbitrary local inferences, ask any kind of conditional or marginal question you want, but you're having to perform an optimization every time you want to do it. The Kingma and Welling setup is really great because we can amortize inference. It's really cheap at test time, but now you're going to be limited in the kind of questions that you can possibly ask, and the answer that you get is necessarily always going to be suboptimal. The idea here being to combine these things and observe that we want to build models that have pieces of both, and that it should be possible to find optimal local factors for this conjugate structure while still performing amortized inference over the things that are hard due to our nonlinear likelihood. To give you a little bit of a flavor of kind of how this works, then you could imagine that we have some time series with some observed data. Ordinarily, we would think of that inducing some local potentials on our graphical model. Here, those are going to be produced by our sort of neural network amortized inference, but we're still going to be able to pull them into your favorite sort of fast message passing procedure for variational inference on the conjugate structure. We can then push that down and then and perform sort of relatively standard gradient updates on the neural network likelihood while being able to perform natural gradient updates on the rest of the structure that has this kind of nice conjugate form. The way I kind of like to think about this is that there's some visible space that has nonlinear structure. We imagine there is some relatively simple latent space, and what we're trying to do, for example, is find a nonlinear mapping such that simple Gaussians can be turned into things that are non-Gaussian, but preserving the kind of that whatever sort of interesting latent structure is present. Put another way, one point of view on supervised learning, and whether you're talking about deep neural networks or kernel methods, is that the name of the game is to try to find a basis in which you have a linear classifier. So even if you're really excited about deep neural networks, at the end of the day, you're putting a logistic regressor or something on the top of this thing, and that is linear. And the hope is that all of these layers have produced a really nice setup so that linear classifier is good. We could view this as a very analogous kind of thing, in which instead of trying to do a linear classification at the end, we're trying to do unsupervised learning with a simple linear state space model or a simple mixture of Gaussians, right? So it's kind of like find a basis in which everything is simple, but just for unsupervised learning rather than supervised learning. Back to the mice, then the idea being that the mouse is actually behaving and the frames of video that we're seeing are living on some lower dimensional manifold in which there are some dynamics that we could understand and that we could model using a probabilistic graphical model. And maybe down the road, we could also do interesting planning and control where we're trying to manipulate the mouse into learning a task faster or achieving some goal. And this relates to some of the posters here that are sort of building on these ideas of latent graphical models for planning, like in particular the solar poster is kind of, I think, very sort of a very similar kind of idea of trying to take this and perform and sort of actually do control in that latent space. Here's some example of going back to the kind of actual things we can identify if our goal is to determine when the mouse is doing something interesting. So here the mouse is kind of on. So these are different mice at different times where the system has identified that the same thing is happening at one time. This is a bunch of cases where the mouse is kind of standing up. This is where the mouse was standing up and kind of falling down. And this is where the mouse is kind of like nuzzling its tummy to groom. So to kind of just to wrap up here, since I think we're trending into the coffee break, then really there's this kind of older work I talked about on the left that is trying to do unsupervised discovery of the ways that mice behave. But looking forward, what we're hoping to be able to do is to turn that into a control task for things like for sort of helping the mouse achieve its own goals faster. I want to take a really quick moment to also mention, so a lot of the work that I've described here was enabled by this tool called AutoGrad that was developed in my group by Matt Johnson and Dougal McLaurin and David Duveno. And Dougal and Matt are now at Google, and they have just relatively recently released this tool called JAX, which is kind of like AutoGrad, but is now sort of supercharged with XLA, so that it can, which is the kind of stuff that sits behind TensorFlow, so that you can now sort of write your code in just NumPy, get arbitrary derivatives and gradients with both forward and reverse mode, and be able to target GPUs and TPUs with just-in-time compilation. So check it out, very cool. I'm not involved in this at all. I just think it's really great, and you should all know about it. And I will stop there. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much for your talk. I think it may be very interesting if you can apply your methods to imitation learning framework, because I mean, you observe the dynamics of the rats or whatever, human beings or whatever, and then you can kind of find a latent variable and graphical model from that, and then you can actually apply this dynamics to or whatever, I mean, to other agents to act. I mean, to mimic the behaviors from the human beings or something like that. Have you thought of applying these techniques?
I mean, we've thought about that in the abstract, but we haven't done it. But you're absolutely right. It seems like an interesting thing to do, because what I said really early on was that essentially what we're doing is trying to summarize a mouse as a Markov transition matrix. Yeah. Well, one sort of interesting way to identify structure in a Markov transition matrix is to say that it arises as the solution to an MDP with some unknown reward, right? Mm-hmm. And so now the reward function could be viewed as a low-dimensional representation of those same matrices. Yeah. And so so that seems like a very natural thing to do. We just haven't done it.
Oh, thank you very much.
So this is a very broad and impressive work. I wasn't clear. Are you trying to use the neuroscience and behavior as a motivation to advance machine learning, or do you actually think that throwing the full power of machine learning at that little mouse is the shortest path to understanding the mouse?
This is a great question. So, I mean, this work that I just described with sort of fancy probabilistic graphical models and things was, the result of actually many years of iteration of just trying to get at objective models for mouse behavior. So, Bob Data, his lab at Harvard Medical School, I mean, this is kind of the business he's in, is trying to, understand mouse behavior in the context of like olfaction and social behaviors and sort of things like that. And but there's this big problem in neuroscience, which is that if we could have the same mice and all the same setup, and if you're on the West Coast and I'm on the East Coast, and we try to run the same experiment, ask our grad students to label the video and so on, you'll have inter-observer error rate that's like 60% or something. And so a lot of the results you'd like to be able to understand are essentially then not really replicable. And so the real task was, let's get to a place where somebody could spend $2,000, buy a Kinect and a reasonable PC, and be able to run the same experiments and get the same results using unsupervised learning. That's the scientific goal. And so in the sort of initial paper that came out of Neuron, we didn't have any deep neural networks or anything. We just kind of iterated through like switching AR models and different things, and then tried to come up with kind of the simplest kind of switching linear system that we could. But ultimately what we found is that the switching linear type systems would over-segment the data. And so if the thing is actually nonlinear and you're asking it to be, you're doing a switching linear dynamical system, then you can get this effect, right, where it will chop things up too much because it's going to wind up with a little local linear approximations. And so the variational autoencoder story actually kind of like emerged later as a solution that felt like we just kind of wound up, we felt like with much better not over-segmented answers. So it's actually, although I sort of talk about it as, oh, look, we're going to apply this model to this problem, it really like the model arose over many years actually from trying to solve the mouse behavior problem.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I have a question about the structured variational autoencoder, and I was wondering basically if we're learning in an unsupervised fashion, what is the key insight or the key idea that allows us to kind of disentangle or like separate these different behaviors into distinct states? Because I would imagine if the likelihood is super nonlinear, then it could happen that we could model various different behaviors using just one latent state.
That's a great question. So, rephrasing that question, what I think you're asking here, and you can confirm, is that like there's a lot of flexibility in these big deep neural network models. How do you know that your deep neural network model isn't absorbing a lot of the flexibility that you'd like to have in your latent space? And the answer is it might be, right? And so I actually don't view this, well, I should say that I view this kind of setup as being equivalent to like semi-parametric statistics, right? So semi-parametric statistics is this idea, you know, a semi-parametric model is one in which you have some interpretable, possibly ideally identifiable structure that you really care about, and then there's going to be a bunch of nuisance structure that you don't care about and that you don't want to model, and so you'd like to throw some relatively flexible statistical model at just that part, kind of plug together these two things. And in that broader view, we still always have this problem, because if you have a flexible non-parametric model and it is too flexible, it can absorb some of the structure that you're hoping to find. So there's no sort of simple answer to that. The way that I like to think about this, and that I think we've kind of zeroed in on, is that in general, when you want to analyze a scientific phenomenon, you build an instrument to study that thing. And when you build an instrument to study something, whether it's a microscope or a telescope or whatever it is, then it's going to have some focal length. You have to make a decision about the scale of the phenomenon that you're going to study. And here we had to make decisions about that kind of flexibility that you're talking about, but also time scale, right? It's also reasonable to say that, okay, so the kind of thing, the syllables we're sort of talking about here are maybe like 200 to 400 milliseconds. But of course, like the mouse is also doing something on the time scale of thousands of milliseconds and also on a time scale of fractions of milliseconds. And there's nothing more or less valid about those other time scales. But when we're trying to sort of do the science of behavior here, we had to make, you have to make decisions about what it is that you're going to look at. And you might disagree on what you care about, but there's not necessarily kind of like a right or wrong answer.
Okay, so let's thank Ryan again.